Sophie laughed, flipping her hair over her shoulder, the dim light of the restaurant reflecting off her diamond-studded earrings. Earrings I had bought her. She looked radiant, confident, smug. "You'll never be as successful as him," she sneered, swirling the wine in her glass with an air of superiority. "I mean, come on, Adrian, let's be real. You've always worked hard, but he's just on another level." I watched her, my expression unreadable. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to argue, to plead, to convince her that she was making a mistake. But I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Ethan sat beside her, his hand resting lazily on her thigh as if staking his claim. He was the kind of man who had never worked a day in his life, but had somehow convinced the world he was a king. Flashy watch, custom-tailored suit, a smirk that told me he thought he had already won. I took a sip of my drink, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "You seem sure about this," I said finally, my voice even. She scoffed. "Of course I am. Ethan knows how to take care of a woman. Successful, ambitious, powerful, everything I need." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice but keeping the venom. "I'm trading up, Adrian. You'll understand one day." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "No hard feelings, man. Some of us are just built for bigger things." I nodded, setting my glass down with deliberate care. "I wish you both the best," I said, and I meant it, but not in the way she thought. Her smile faltered, just for a second before she forced it back. She had expected a fight, a desperate plea. Instead, I had given her nothing, and that unsettled her more than any argument ever could. I stood, adjusting the cuff of my jacket. "Enjoy your evening," I said, turning without another word. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked away. Maybe, just maybe, a tiny part of her had wondered if she was making a mistake. But she buried it under the thrill of her upgrade. That was 6 months ago. Tonight, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered, already knowing who it was. Sophie's voice cracked through the line, desperation replacing her once unshakable arrogance. "Adrienne," she breathed, her words rushed and uneven. I made a mistake." I leaned back in my chair, allowing myself a small smile. "I guess I did end up more successful," I said before hanging up. The night Sophie walked out of my life, she thought she was stepping into a fairy tale. I could see it in her eyes, the way they sparkled with excitement at the prospect of a life filled with luxury, high-end vacations, and exclusive parties. To her, Ethan was the golden ticket, the man who could offer her everything she believed I never could. She envisioned herself draped in designer gowns, sipping champagne on a yacht, basking in the glow of wealth and power. For a while, I'm sure it seemed like her fantasy had come true. She moved into his sleek penthouse, the kind of place she had always dreamed of. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, a private terrace, imported marble floors. Every time she posted on social media, she made sure the world knew she had leveled up. Pictures of her at Michelin-starred restaurants, uh, shopping bags from exclusive boutiques, glimpses of extravagant jewelry flashing on her finger. The comments flooded in. Her friends gushed about how lucky she was, how she had finally found a real man who could give her the life she deserved. But fairy tales have a way of turning into nightmares when you're too blinded by greed to see the warning signs. Ethan was everything she thought she wanted until he wasn't. It started subtly. The way he would check her phone over her shoulder, the questions that seemed harmless at first but grew more invasive. "Who were you texting? Why didn't you answer my call right away?" At first, she laughed it off, telling herself it was just because he cared. But the questions turned into accusations. The affection he once showered her with turned cold. Compliments became criticisms. "Are you really wearing that?" he'd ask, eyes scanning her with disapproval. "You've been spending a lot lately," he muttered one evening, tapping a finger against the rim of his glass. "Maybe tone it down." Sophie, who had once flaunted his wealth as if it were her own, found herself shrinking under his scrutiny. The same man who had lured her in with luxury was now rationing it like a prize she had to earn. He had no interest in a partner, he wanted a possession. And when possessions lose their novelty, they become disposable. The first time she realized she was no longer in control was when her credit card got declined at a boutique. Confused, she called Ethan, expecting an apology, maybe a quick transfer of funds to fix the issue. Instead, his voice was indifferent. "I canceled it," he said simply. "You were getting carried away." The air left her lungs. "You? What?" He sighed. "I take care of the bills, Sophie. You don't need to worry about money. Just focus on being here when I need you to be." That was the moment the illusion cracked. She wasn't independent. She wasn't living the dream. She was trapped. As the months passed, the cracks deepened. The expensive gifts stopped. The affectionate gestures disappeared. He started disappearing too. Nights out without explanation, business trips that stretched longer than they should. She asked questions. He gave her silence. Then, one evening, she found out the truth in the most humiliating way possible. She had planned a romantic dinner hoping to recapture the spark that had drawn her to him in the first place. She wore the dress he once called his favorite, spent hours making sure everything was perfect, but Ethan never showed. Hours later, she scrolled through social media, her hands trembling. There he was, at a bar, his arm wrapped around a woman younger, thinner, more glamorous than she had ever been. A woman who looked at him the way she once had. That's when it hit her. She wasn't special. She was just another conquest, another accessory to his wealth. And just like a designer watch or a sleek sports car, she had lost her shine. By the time she confronted him, he didn't even bother lying. "Come on, Sophie," he said, shaking his head like she was a child throwing a tantrum. "You really thought this was forever?" Her knees nearly gave out. "But I gave up everything for you." He smirked, and then "I guess that was your mistake." And just like that, the fairy tale was over. No money, no home, nothing. Ethan had stripped away everything, leaving her standing in the ruins of a life she had willingly chosen. She had mocked me when she walked away, believing she had won. But as she sat alone in the apartment Ethan had just kicked her out of, staring at a phone screen filled with unanswered calls and unread messages, she realized the truth. But she hadn't traded up. She had gambled and lost everything. With shaking hands, she scrolled to my number. Her pride screamed at her not to do it, but desperation drowns pride. She pressed call. Sophie had never felt this kind of desperation before. She had always been the one in control, the one making choices that suited her best. For years, she had navigated relationships like a chessboard, always thinking a few steps ahead, always making sure she came out on top. When she left me, she thought she had made the smartest move of her life, a calculated decision to trade what she saw as comfort for luxury, stability for excitement. Now she was back at square one. No, worse than that, she was nowhere. Ethan had kicked her out without a second thought, and the reality of her situation hit her like a tidal wave. She had no savings. Why would she? She had always relied on men to take care of her. The apartment she had once bragged about wasn't even in her name. Her designer bags and expensive shoes? Worthless when she didn't have enough money to pay for a cab. She tried calling Ethan first, clinging to the hope that maybe this was just another one of his games. Another test to see if she was desperate enough to beg. He didn't answer. She tried again and again. By the fifth call, she was staring at her reflection in the cracked screen of her phone, realizing how pathetic she looked. Mascara smudged, her once perfect hair now tangled from stress, her lips trembling as she whispered, "What have I done?" She tried her so-called friends next, the ones who had cheered her on when she left me, who had told her she was making the right choice. Not one of them picked up. They had been happy to celebrate her leveling up when she had Ethan's money behind her. Now, with nothing to offer, she was nothing to them. That left only one number, mine. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Calling me meant admitting defeat. It meant acknowledging that she had made the worst mistake of her life. It meant swallowing every smug word she had thrown in my face the night she left. But she had no choice. She pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. For a moment, she thought I wouldn't answer. Then my voice came through, calm, composed, completely indifferent. "Sophie?" She inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. "Adrian." She expected her voice to sound confident, the way it always had when she spoke to me before, but instead it cracked, revealing just how broken she truly was. There was a pause. Then I asked, "Why are you calling me?" Her breath hitched. How was she supposed to say it? How was she supposed to admit that the man she thought was better than me had left her with nothing? That the life she had so proudly chosen had crumbled beneath her feet? I made a mistake," she whispered, her throat tightening. Another silence, a long one this time. She imagined me sitting in my office, maybe glancing at the time, debating whether or not to hang up. Then I spoke. "I figured you would." The words stung more than she expected them to. "I know I hurt you," she said quickly, hoping to soften me before I could dismiss her completely. "I was wrong, Adrian. I see that now. You were always good to me. You always cared about me. And I didn't appreciate that the way I should have." I let out a breath. "And now that Ethan's done with you, I'm supposed to, what, save you?" She flinched. The truth, when laid out so plainly, was brutal. But I had never been the type to sugarcoat things. "No, I thought maybe we could talk." I don't know where else to go. She hated how weak she sounded. The Sophie from 6 months ago would have cringed at this version of herself. Pleading, vulnerable, exposed. I didn't say anything at first. Then I chuckled. It was quiet, almost amused. You know what's funny, Sophie? My voice was smooth, effortless. The night you left me, I told you I wished you the best. And I meant it. I really did. Because I knew this day would come. I didn't have to chase revenge. I didn't have to do anything. I just had to keep moving forward while you walked yourself straight into the consequences of your own choices. Her throat tightened. Adrian, please. You were so sure you were trading up, I continued, ignoring her interruption. You thought Ethan was the answer to everything, and now you're sitting in some empty apartment, calling the man you left behind, hoping he'll pick up the pieces for you. She squeezed her eyes shut. I never meant to. Doesn't matter what you meant, Sophie. What matters is what you did. A tear slipped down her cheek. She knew where this was going. She had lost me. For good. I let the silence stretch, letting her sit with her regrets for just a few more seconds. Then, with a calm finality, I said, I guess I did end up more successful. And I hung up. Sophie stared at the screen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For the first time in her life, she understood what true loss felt like. Not the loss of money, not the loss of luxury, the loss of a man who had truly loved her. And this time there was no getting him back. Sophie sat motionless, the phone still clutched in her trembling hand, staring at the blank screen as if it might come back to life. But it didn't. No message, no call back, no second chance. Adrian had hung up on her. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. The weight of it settled in her chest, like a stone, pressing down with every breath. She had spent years believing that no matter what happened, no matter how badly she screwed up, there would always be someone willing to catch her. A safety net woven from charm, beauty, and well-timed apologies. But this time, there was no net. She had burned every bridge, cashed in every favor, and now there was no one left to call. Her apartment was nearly empty. Just a suitcase of clothes, a half-broken chair she had found by the dumpster, and a mattress on the floor. The place was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that made her ears ring, made her thoughts echo louder than they should. She could still remember the last time she had been in a place like this. Years ago, before Adrian, before Ethan, before she had learned how to play the game. Back then, she had been young and ambitious, determined to carve out a life for herself without struggling. She had been smart enough to recognize a good man when she saw one, and Adrian had been exactly that. Stable, hardworking, loyal. But she had never wanted stability. Not really. She had wanted excitement, wealth, the rush of something bigger and shinier, so she had left. And now, all these years later, she had nothing to show for it. Her fingers hovered over her phone, tempted to call him again, to try one more time. Maybe, if she explained better, if she sounded more apologetic, if she could just get him to talk to her for another minute. No, she squeezed her eyes shut. The way he had spoken to her, calm, detached, almost amused, it was worse than anger. If he had yelled, if he had cursed her name, at least that would have meant he still felt something. But he didn't. Adrian had moved on, and she was nothing more than an afterthought. Her eyes burned as she set the phone down. Outside, the city was still alive, indifferent to her misery. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, the occasional burst of laughter from pedestrians below. It reminded her of all the nights she had spent in places like this. Rooftop bars, luxury lounges, VIP events, where everything had seemed effortless. She had been the woman everyone wanted to be. Now, she was just another washed-up pretty face who had bet on the wrong man. She pulled her knees to her chest, her mind racing through every mistake, every sign she had ignored. Ethan had never been the prize. She could see that now. It had been Adrian all along. She had spent so much time looking for something better that she hadn't realized she already had it. The way he had always supported her dreams, the way he had treated her like she mattered, not as an accessory, not as a trophy, but as a partner. And she had thrown it all away. Her stomach twisted as she remembered the night she left. How confident she had been, how smug. She had practically laughed in his face, telling him she was trading up. And now she was the one begging for his attention. She let out a bitter laugh, wiping at her eyes. Was this how Adrian had felt that night? The helplessness, the humiliation, the realization that she had never really seen him for who he was? If she had stayed, if she had just appreciated him, loved him the way he deserved, would they have been happy? Would they have built something real? She'd never know, because Adrian wasn't coming back. She reached for her phone again, not to call, but to scroll through their old messages, the ones from when things had been good, the ones where he would send her pictures of something he had cooked, ask how her day was, tell her he loved her before bed. All of them unread now. She clicked on his contact, hesitated, then typed a message. Please, let's talk. Her thumb hovered over the send button. Would he even read it? Would he care? She stared at the single word below the text box. Delivered. No response. Minutes passed. Then hours. Still nothing. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, all she could hear was his voice. I guess I did end up more successful. She turned onto her side, staring at the darkened screen, waiting for a reply that would never come. And for the first time in her life, Sophie understood what true regret felt like. Not the fleeting kind, not the kind you shake off with a drink or a shopping spree. The real kind, the kind that lingers, that eats at you, that whispers in the back of your mind. You lost the best thing you ever had and you'll never get it back. And this time, there was no one else to blame but herself. The next morning, Sophie woke up to the sound of silence. No messages, no missed calls, just the cold reality that Aderon had truly, irrevocably moved on. For a few seconds, in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, she almost forgot where she was. She reached across the mattress as if expecting to find warmth beside her, only to remember that she was alone. Not just alone in bed, alone in life. The walls of the tiny apartment seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the scent of regret. It had been barely 24 hours since she had called Adrian, but it felt like an eternity. She checked her phone again, desperate for any sign that he had changed his mind. Nothing. She clenched her jaw, swallowing the lump in her throat. Adrian wasn't playing hard to get. He was done. The realization hit harder than she expected. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she had believed that no matter how bad things got, she could always go back to him, that he would be waiting, still caring, still hoping. But he wasn't. He had left her in the past, exactly where she belonged. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples as a dull headache pounded behind her eyes. She hadn't eaten much the night before, hadn't slept well either. Every time she had drifted off, her mind had replayed Adrian's voice, his calm detachment, the way he had dismissed her with just a few words. I guess I did end up more successful. It was worse than an insult, worse than anger. That was the truth. She had spent so long chasing wealth and status, convinced that money equaled success. But Adrian had built something real. Without needing validation, without needing to prove himself to anyone. And now he was thriving while she was drowning. With a deep breath, she forced herself out of bed. She needed to do something, anything, to distract herself. She couldn't sit here, waiting for a response that would never come. But when she stood, she realized she had nowhere to go, no friends to call, no plans, no purpose. For years, her life had been about finding the next best thing. The richer man, the better lifestyle, the grander future. Now, stripped of it all, she had nothing to hold on to. For the first time in her life, she was forced to sit with herself. And she didn't like what she found. She grabbed her phone again, this time searching for Adrian's name on social media. His profile was still there, but something had changed. His life was no longer just his own. There were pictures, ones she hadn't seen before. Adrian at a business event, shaking hands with executives, his confidence radiating through the screen. Adrian on vacation, standing in front of a villa that made Ethan's penthouse look like a cheap rental. And then the picture that shattered her completely. Adrian with someone new. A woman stunning in an effortless way, not like the ones Sophie had competed with in the past. She wasn't dripping in diamonds or wrapped in designer labels. But the way Adrian looked at her, that was something Sophie had never seen before. Real happiness. Not the comfortable kind he had once shared with Sophie, but something deeper, unshakable, certain. He had found someone who saw his worth before it was too late. A hollow laugh escaped her lips as he set the phone down. She had wasted so much time thinking she was irreplaceable. And yet, here Adrian was, building a life, moving forward, proving that the only person who had truly lost anything was her. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to blame someone, something, anything for how things had turned out. But she couldn't. This was her doing. She had gambled, she had lost, and now she had to live with it. With a deep breath, Sophie stood up. She wasn't sure where she would go, what she would do, or how she would start over. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, there was no safety net, no second chances, no way back. Only the long, lonely road ahead. Adrian, he would never think of her again.